Live from Vermont Public Television, it's Report from Washington. Tonight, Congressman Peter Welch answers your questions and discusses the day's top issues and how they'll affect us in Vermont. As always, you can call our toll-free line or email us at connect@vpt.org. Your questions help drive the discussion. Here's Mark Johnson.
Good evening and welcome to Report from Washington. It's really our great pleasure tonight to have Congressman Peter Welch joining us. But we would even more so like to hear from you tonight, and I would imagine tonight that there will be a number of questions for the Congressman, particularly on the big issue of the day in Syria. So we encourage you to call us. You can reach us at 1-866-424-LIVE, and you can also send us an email at connect@vpt.org. Congressman Welch, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
We actually want to begin tonight. We're going to hear a short excerpt of President Obama's speech to the country on Tuesday night. This came after a back and forth where it appeared as though Congress was going to be voting on whether or not to have military action against Syria for their alleged use of chemical weapons. But instead, the president backed off on that. And in the intervening time, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, made an offer to try to get the Syrians to put their chemical weapons under international control. The president addressed that issue.
In part because of the credible threat of U.S. military action, as well as constructive talks that I had with President Putin, the Russian government has indicated a willingness to join with the international community in pushing Assad to give up his chemical weapons. The Assad regime has now admitted that it has these weapons and even said they joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits their use. It's too early to tell whether this offer will succeed, and any agreement must verify that the Assad regime keeps its commitments. But this initiative has the potential to remove the threat of chemical weapons without the use of force, particularly because Russia is one of Assad's strongest allies.
We'll talk about this issue more broadly in a moment, but let me first start and ask you pointedly, do you trust the Russians as being an honest broker in these negotiations?
I don't necessarily, but here's the bottom line. The last thing this country needed was another war in the Middle East. And the last thing Syrian families needed was another chemical attack. And we were on the edge of having Congress vote where we either would have rejected the president's request, and there would have been some downside to that. Would that have given a green light to Assad, or approving it, where there would have been an attack, and then it would have, I think, unleashed things that were well beyond our control to contain. So the fact that the Russians came in gave us an opportunity to avert, I think, the worst of both worlds. Now, here's the thing. Russians aren't our friends. They've got their own interest. But they have some common interest with us. They do not want those chemical weapons unleashed. They don't want proliferation. They have terrorists in their own country. That's number one. And number two, in that awful, violent civil war in Syria, they do not want a Sunni radical Islamic victory, nor do we. That wouldn't be good for the region. So the common interest that the U.S. and Russia has, interestingly enough, has been obscured because of all the disputes we've been having with Russia. So who knows? We'll see how they do, whether they'll help us. But it's not so much trust, but there is those two common interests I mentioned.
How long would you give this process?
Well, frankly, I think I'm kind of hopeful about this because the process is going to take a while, even with the good faith of both. Let's assume Syria had good faith, which is tough, but Russia did. This is in a wartime situation, so the actual implementation under the best of circumstances would be complicated and drawn out. So I'm willing to give that some time, as long as what we hope is that Assad's gotten the message that Congress isn't going to give him a second chance, and who knows, the president may not. You know, he made a major decision when instead of just using what he regarded his commander-in-chief authority to pull the trigger, he came back to Congress. Now, there were a number of us, 18 Democrats, me among them, who asked the president to do that. But it gave the chance to the American people to weigh into this debate and to be heard. And, you know, American people have had it with these wars in the Middle East.
There has been some question about who fired these chemical weapons. We got an email from Stephen Wark in Burlington who says there is reason to believe Syrian rebels were behind the gas attacks. Why have we not seen any of our intelligence? In my humble opinion, the situation is that we want Assad gone, and this is an excuse, as was 9/11 for Iraq, as we now know.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I don't buy it at all. And it's not on the basis of the intelligence reports where, as a member of Congress, I was briefed on. It's just sort of the common sense Vermonter test. These were indisputably fired from government-controlled areas. It's unquestioned that they landed in rebel-controlled areas. And these were sophisticated weapons that all the intelligence indicates only Syria had it in its control. So I always believed that the intelligence was accurate. That's number one. And number two, I also thought that the president had a point. All of us are concerned about the use of chemical weapons. 98% of the countries have ratified this chemical weapon treaties, and it's all as a result of what the horrors we experienced in the First World War, where some of our troops were on the receiving end of that awful mustard gas. And international norms are good to enforce. The question that a lot of us had in Congress, and a lot of Vermonters had, I got practical questions from Vermonters, was, all right, we'd like to do what we can, but if we act with a military strike, will it actually make a very bad situation worse? And frankly, that's where I think a lot of people were focused.
I spoke to you last week on my radio program, and you said that you wanted to get more information. You wanted to see the intelligence. You wanted to go to these hearings. What did you learn in those hearings?
Well, not a lot new. You know, bottom line here, you get intelligence briefings. They'll give you some specifics about what their signal traffic is, about which Syrian commanders they heard, about what they heard from Hezbollah. They'll give you some satellite imaging. But the bottom line here is that I found that the basic questions that Vermonters were asking me, and the basic common sense approach to this, you know, they were fired from government controlled into rebel control, Syria government controlled into the rebel control, and then the questions that Vermonters asked. All right, we'd like to stop them, but on the other hand, what does that mean if we have a strike? Does that mean we're dragged into the Civil War? Those were much more operative. So the intelligence part of this was not the core of it. The core of this was, do we want to risk getting in another Civil War? And, you know, I had two goals. One of the questions you asked me when I was on your radio program, and a lot of Vermonters said, is where do you stand? How are you going to vote? And I understood that, and I was expressing the enormous reservations I had about force. And I think it was pretty clear that I was a skeptic, that this was a wise thing to do. But when you have this position and represent Vermonters, and you have an opportunity to affect the outcome by how you proceed, I had two goals, which I think were Vermonters' goals. One, we didn't want a war. And number two, to the extent we could, we wanted to protect Syrian families from another attack. So holding on and letting that process develop, which actually was something that the president allowed by coming back to Congress, and then opened up the debate, not just in Congress, but among the American people. And Vermonters, it was unbelievable the way they contacted my office, Bernie's office, and Patrick's office. And these were not the usual sort of advocates, official advocates. It was everyday people, you know, school teachers, the guy in the deli, the dump attendant where I bring my recycling. I mean, people had opinions, and a lot of that opinion was forged by 11 years of endless war in the Middle East, where what do we have to show for it? And people felt they were pretty burned by the proposals to get us in there.
Okay, so you heard from an awful lot of people in the last week or so. You know, I felt at the end of the interview that you and I had that you were such a skeptic that you would have voted no that day. Another reporter who heard the same interview said he thought you were leaning yes. So in terms of not showing your cards about how you would have voted on it, it was a masterful job and unclear. So if you had to vote today, how would you vote?
Well, that's the point I'm making. I mean, I don't think it would have been helpful for us to have a military strike. All right, but I also don't think it would be helpful for the world to give a green light to a man who had possession of an enormous chemical weapon stockpile. So how do you reach both agreements? Because you do one and you unleash the other. You do the other and you have the downside of possibly getting dragged into a war. So what you have when you're in my position, especially when you're from the party of the president, is an opportunity to try to push the president and the administration to give diplomacy more of a chance. Now, I think that was the inclination that President Obama clearly had, all right? He has been incredibly restrained on Syria. You know, there's a lot of folks in Congress, Senator McCain is foremost among them, who want us to plunge in on the side of the Syrian rebels. And the president said no. And he has gotten us out of Iraq, and he's gotten us back from Afghanistan. So what's my job here? Is it to just pronounce a position right away, or is it to do the smart things that help get us to the result that we all want, namely no war and no more chemical weapons? So, you know, it's worked out so far, and who knows what's going to happen down the line, because a lot of this is going to be on Assad. If he unleashes those weapons on his own people, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure. But think about where we're at now as a result of the president being willing to bring it back to the Congress, as a result of a lot of us Vermonters and me as their representative pushing for keeping diplomacy as an option, and then being surprised, a lot of us, by Russia coming in, which had we just pulled the trigger when the president was talking about it, there wouldn't have been that opportunity. So now you've got Russia, who's been our adversary, having a stake in success, and success is no more chemical weapons and ultimately getting these under control. So this was a very tense situation, and Vermonters, you know, I really listened quite carefully. You know, we did the telephone town hall meeting. We had a huge turnout. I was on a number of radio programs, including yours, and I was out and about listening to folks all the way. And while on the one hand, how are you going to vote, Peter, was the fair question, what they were telling me is they didn't want a war, and they really were concerned about those poor children that were getting gassed by a dictator.
If this effort is successful and Assad can be verified somehow that his chemical weapons are under national control, is that good enough for you?
Well, it's good enough on the chemical weapon issue, all right? And see, this is where there's a distinction. You know, people really were making an equation with Iraq where we really got burned. You know, the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, it was all a pretext because the president wanted to have, quote, regime change. And the situation in Syria is two separate issues. One, what should the world community in the U.S. do if a dictator is in violation of the Chemical Weapons Treaty and the Geneva Conference ban on the use of chemical weapons? Should there be a retaliation? In fact, there's a fair argument that there should be. You know, it's very tough to see how we do that if it's just the U.S. alone. The second question, which is much more problematic, is should we be involved in the civil war? And frankly, I don't think we should. That's a catastrophe. It's full of heartache. I was at a Syrian refugee camp that was on the border of Turkey and Syria. I was as close to the Syrian border as I am to you right now. And you know, your heart breaks. It was women and children, because the husbands and the sons were all off in Syria. And many of the kids and a lot of the women had wicked injuries, and they were on the receiving end of mortar attacks and artillery barrages by the Assad regime. And it's heartbreaking. And they were pleading with us to go in and make it right. But you know what? It's a Sunni-Shia conflict that has been festering for generations. And is it practically possible for an outside force to impose peace between parties that have been feuding for generations? Well, you know what? I think common sense Vermonters say, you know, we just can't do it. Vermonters want to help.
Let's deal with the first part of this, though, the chemical part of it. If Assad gives up his chemical weapons, is that sufficient, or should there be some sanction punishment for what he's already done? Or is giving him up good enough?
On a practical level, we've got to stay out. I mean, if we're trying to up the ante that in a way that draws us into the Civil War, that's a mistake, okay? So a lot of times what the ideal is not the achievable goal, and you have to accept the goal that's within reach and is practical and is consistent with the price that you're willing to ask the American people to pay. And I don't want us in another war in the Middle East. And in fact, you know, in the Congress, in this last budget, I introduced legislation with Chris Gibson, a Republican from across the lake, that would have prohibited any taxpayer dollars being used to fund Syrian rebels. And that's not because I like Assad, it's because I don't have confidence that we can give it to the, quote, good rebels versus the bad rebels getting it. And Mr. Boehner, who has the authority to say yes or no on whether an amendment will be considered, kept that off the floor. And a lot of us, Republican colleagues of mine and Democrats, think it was because they feared it would pass.
Let's go to Colchester. Mel, good evening. You're on the air.
Thank you. The question is kind of ironic that the program follows the program on the Holocaust, where basically the world, in many cases, were aware of certain things, but it stood by. What would be the level of gassing from the dictator before the Congress reacts? 10,000, 20,000? Where is the moral compass that says no more?
Okay.
Well, you've asked the existential question that I think is gut-wrenching, because if any of us, let's just take it off the geopolitical level, we see some suffering, hungry families in your town, homeless people. Everything in your heart wants to respond if you can, but there's limits on what you can do. You've got obligations to your family. You've got obligations to your community. You've got limited resources. So the fact that you want to help doesn't always mean that you can. And in Syria, the situation that the president responded to, he did want to respond because the norm was violated. And he made a very compelling argument. But there was a practical question of whether the American people could sustain that. Would they be willing to support it? Would we end up in our desire to help, in our steps to help, actually make a very bad situation worse? Those are real world constraints that have to be addressed if you're going to make that decision. So, you asked a good question, and that's why if we ultimately had to vote, no matter what happened, I was not going to feel good about it. Because if I voted no in order to keep us out of the risk of a war, that's a good thing. But would that give a green light to Assad so it would go from 1,000 or so who died to 4,000 to 10,000? And we don't know.
But you didn't see anything in this intelligence that would have put you definitely in the category of we've got to do a military strike.
No, I did not. This was not an intel-driven deal. I mean, the question on intel was, do we have reliable confidence that this was a chemical weapons attack that was originated by the Assad regime? And I was confident the answer to that was yes. That's all. But then the harder questions were really about this conflict that the previous caller said. I mean, where do you draw the line? Mm-hmm. And you want to draw the line at zero. You don't want anybody. But what can you do? And that's a real world decision.
Let's go to Fairfax. Donald, good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, I agree with Mr. Welch that it is a world decision, and I think that the United States should not go it alone. There should be a majority of the UN. If why should the United States have the right to declare war on any country? There should be a majority of the UN, if need be, that military action, sanctions, or whatever. It should be with the majority of the UN, and not just the United States, because that's only going to bring more harm to us.
All right. Let me get the Congressman to comment. Thank you.
See, it's a really good point. I mean, this is an international norm, so why is it that only the United States would be enforcing it? That undercuts the legitimacy, and it is an unreasonable expectation that the American people, our American soldiers, and our American taxpayers are the ones that have to do everything, when supposedly we've all made an agreement that this is crossing a line.
The president, in his speech earlier this week, addressed this issue and denied that the United States was the world's policeman.
America's not the world's policeman. Terrible things happen across the globe, and it is beyond our means to right every wrong. But when, with modest effort and risk, we can stop children from being gassed to death and thereby make our own children safer over the long run, I believe we should act.
Sure seems like we are the world's policeman.
Well, it's not working out. People are burned out with these wars that we've had. Iraq was a war on false pretenses. It has made the Middle East more volatile, not less so. Afghanistan, we had a reason to go in there. That's where Osama bin Laden was. He was being given safe haven. But after the initial attack, we changed to a strategy of nation building, which has just been a failure. And the president, to his credit, got us out of Iraq and is bringing us home from Afghanistan. And, our goal has to be to protect national security interest of our people, It's not to turn all these countries that have no history with democracy and have literally centuries of feuding. The Sunni-Shia split has been going on for generations. We're not going to be able, with American soldiers and even American money, to make that right.
At the same time, towards the end of the speech that the president gave, he talked about American exceptionalism and how we're an exceptional country. And I think some people interpret that as we somehow think we're better than everybody. Did that phrase and his use of that phrase make you uncomfortable in any way?
Well, if it was with the interpretation that you ascribe to it that we're better, yeah, because, you know, none of us should think we're better than anybody. You know, I mean, one Vermonter doesn't think he or she is better than another Vermonter. But where we have a right to be proud is we've got the oldest constitutional democracy in the globe. And that's something that each of us has a responsibility to sustain. And in that sense, we are unique. I mean, we have the oldest democracy. And when you watch as an observer from Vermont, even with our dysfunctional Congress, you know, we're going through a tough time now, and people are pretty frustrated with Congress. But we have endured as a democracy through depressions, through world wars, through civil rights conflicts, and there's a lot that America can be proud of. But it would be a mistake for us to have that pride be translated into a feeling of superiority. You know, and when you're confident in yourself, you don't have to do that.
If this negotiation doesn't work out, do you see under any circumstance that you would support a military strike?
Well, I think the big question that would change a lot of things for a lot of people, including a lot of countries, would be if Assad used chemical weapons on a significant scale again. I mean, that I think would really be something that would it would generate the world community reaction, even possibly Russia. So if he starts using them on a widespread basis, I think it's a game changer in terms of not just U.S. attitudes or congressional attitudes, but I think world community attitudes, and you might even see the UN get involved. So we have to see how that develops. But, you know, I'm hopeful that whatever comes of this, Assad has gotten he's figured it out. This is really a bad news thing for him to do.
Okay, what if he doesn't use them again? Punishment for what he's already done? Could you in any way support a military strike on that if these negotiations fail?
Well, I think he should be held accountable for a war crime. I do.
How else can you hold him accountable other than a military action?
A war crime. I mean, I believe that in that conflict, those who've committed war crimes should be tried and convicted and punished by the International Tribunal. And my view is that using chemical weapons clearly is a war crime.
Why wouldn't that be done no matter what? Even if he gave up the weapons, would you be willing to not pursue that route?
No, I'd want to do that.
So no matter what, even if he gives up his chemical weapons, that he's going to be pursued?
There's got to be. I think there should be some consequences. But, you know, that in the consequences should be from the world community that has embraced this norm of not using chemical weapons. This is not something that should just be enforced by the United States of America. I mean, you know, the president's concern was preservation of the norm and protection of people from a future chemical attack. So if Assad is not doing it in the future, that's good, but he should be punished for what he's done.
If you're just tuning in, you're watching Report from Washington. Our guest tonight is Congressman Peter Welch. You're welcome to join us at 1-866-424-LIVE. You can also send us an email at connect@vpt.org. In fact, we do have an email from James Enity in East Montpelier who asks, if there is a vote for military intervention, how will it be paid for? I feel that it cannot come from current revenues and should be paid by a new tax, example, Wall Street transaction tax, carbon tax.
I agree with him. You know, in Iraq, we went to war. It cost $1 trillion. We never paid for it. It was on the credit card. Afghanistan, on the credit card. He's got a point. And in fact, a number of us, Jim McGovern and I, want there to be a requirement that if you're going to vote for an expenditure like that, you've got to pay for it up front. Pardon me.
Another email question, one that you and I have discussed and one that you've heard frequently, which is Tariq asks, does it make a difference for the victims of Assad regime to be killed by chemical weapons or another type of regular weapons, noting that more than 100,000 civilians have been killed?
Pardon my cold. Pardon me. It doesn't make a difference if you're on the receiving end. It does make a difference in international law. Pardon me.
All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick commercial break here. We're going to come back. We're going to continue our discussion with Congressman Peter Welch, and you're watching Report from Montpelier. We are back. You're watching Report from Washington. Let's actually get right back to the phone. We go to Colchester next. Christy, good evening. You're on the air.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure. Do you have a question for the Congressman?
Yes. I'm watching you, and it's a little delayed. Okay. Yes, I do. For the life of me, I keep thinking of why would Assad, I watched him on Charlie Rose, pretty interesting interview. Seems like a pretty savvy guy, dictator, and I guess ruthless too. But why he knows that gassing people is an anathema to the whole international, especially to the United States, and would give us every reason to jump in and attack him. Why would he choose this method politically and militarily at this time, especially with the UN inspectors showing up in Syria? To me, it just doesn't make sense. And I just was wondering what, Peter, and I hope you feel better.
I hope I do, too.
Yeah.
Thank you for your call. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly a question I initially asked, and I talked to some military people about it, and here's what they explained. There were two things. One, the Syrian regime was really frustrated that this rebel group was holding on to a suburb in Damascus, and they had been frustrated at their inability to get rid of them. So they ended up having a lot of support from commanders to do a tactical strike, which started with a barrage of conventional artillery, and then second, following up with the gas, which obviously was going to be devastating for the people in that zone. And then third, it was to be followed up with more artillery and troop infiltration. So it was seen and probably advocated by on-the-ground commanders as a tactical way of achieving the goal from their perspective of getting rebels out of that area. What is unclear, there was no intelligence, and this has been reported, where there's a phone call from Assad saying to do this. But you can imagine, this is my best guess, I don't have any evidence of this, but that some battle commanders see this as a tool that they can use, and they're not actually taking into account some of those political considerations that you just described.
What would you say, you've heard from a lot of people, you've talked to a lot of people, how's it running in Vermont? 5-1, 10-1 against, what?
Oh, it's overwhelmingly opposed to it. I mean, just overwhelming. It was two things, though. Even some people who were really overwhelmingly and very vigorously opposed, because they do not want another Iraq or Afghanistan. They had a lot of concern about the use of gas, and they wrestled with the question, all right, we say no to a strike. What happens? Is that a green light for Assad? So people, on balance, were strongly opposed to it, and that was the overwhelming reaction that I got. And I think Bernie and Patrick, it was the same thing. But Vermonters have also been concerned, opposed to bad wars, dumb wars, costly wars that aren't paid for. But Vermonters have always been supportive of any steps that make a bad situation more humane, like the chemical weapons ban. Vermonters support that. The landmines ban that Jody Williams from Southern Vermont won a Nobel Prize for. Vermonters are supportive of that.
Speaking of the military, Paul in South Burlington emailed and asked what efforts you're going to make to try to cut the bloated, as he described it, $700 billion military budget, and how can you do that by supporting the F-35?
Well, there's two questions. Okay, one is I voted against the defense budgets because they have been bloated, as you say. Another is that one of the earlier callers said if we're in Iraq or Afghanistan, should that be paid for? And the answer is yes. And I voted that we should be required to pay for it because that puts a constraint on it. But we do need a national defense. So the F-35 issue is really two separate questions. If you have an Air Force and you have an Air Guard, you need airplanes. And I do believe we need airplanes. And the F-35s have had cost overrun issues and a lot of things that are legitimate to be criticized, but we do need planes. And before I was in Congress, these were authorized. We've built some, and they've got to be placed somewhere. And they're the new generation of planes for our Air Force. So the question with the siting is, are they in Burlington with our Air Guard, or are they some other location? And clearly, our Guard is going to be better off with the most modern equipment, and that's good for the airport. And it creates real challenges in the community, which I'm hearing about loud and clear. And my strong and fervent hope is that our Guard is going to work with that community to try to mitigate and address those concerns as much as we possibly can.
But if this program were going to be located in some other state other than Vermont, you wouldn't be speaking out about the wisdom of the F-35 program in general?
No, I'd be glad to have questions about the F-35 has had wicked cost overruns. They're starting to come under pressure now.
So why aren't you opposing it on that basis before you even get to the question of where it's sited?
Well, number one, the F-35 was the decision that Congress made before I was there. All right, so you can affect things when you're in Congress, but you don't have a vote before you're there. So this is a decision that was made.
Okay, but the cost overruns have also just accelerated in the period of time that you've been there, too. It's a different program, in a sense, than what Congress approved.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Well, the cost, the overruns have escalated in the 8 years that you've been down there.
That's right. Military contracting is not working. And it's not just the F-35, it's a lot of the big ticket items, including like even MRAPs. So pick your weapon system. We've got a system that doesn't work. And I've been a very strong proponent of trying to fix our contracting system. And actually, I think a lot of our weapon systems are overdone. And some of the weapon systems that members of Congress support you don't need. But you do need planes. And the F-16 is very old. So the issue of how to have the contract come in on budget and on time is one issue, but the question of whether you need a plane is another. And you do need planes in the Air Force. So that decision's been made. And here the question is, where are you going to put them? You're going to put them in Burlington, you're going to put them in Texas. And if that's the question, and they're good in terms of our Guard and our airport, that's relevant.
Just today, a story came out that the Department of Defense has identified a number of sites for the East Coast Missile Defense System, and one of them is Camp Ethan Allen in Jericho, the old firing range. What do you think about that idea, Congressman?
It's pretty silly, really kind of absurd. And I'll tell you, here's the difference with that and the F-35. That's the kind of the Star Wars fantasy program of the Reagan administration, and somehow it's trying to get resurrected, and we just don't need it. It's not going to make us more secure. It doesn't meet national defense needs.
Back on the question of Syria, and grab a sip of tea there. I'll ask my question as slowly as I possibly can. How important is it to you? How big a factor in your deliberation is being a Democrat, loyalty to the president, not wanting to have the president out there and look bad?
It's not a factor. It could be a challenge for me, but it's not a factor. On an issue like that, you've got to reach deep into your soul and do what you think is right for the country. And I was prepared to do that. Now, the opportunity that you have when the president is of your party is that they will pay some attention to your advocacy. I was one of the early members of Congress to call on the president to bring this to Congress. And it turned out that was very instrumental in us getting a solution where the Russians are involved. I got called over to the White House to meet with the Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, and I'm able to weigh into him and tell him, look, this is tough, and here's the things we think. And there's an awful lot of desire that we do diplomacy. There were 10 of us that met with Vice President Biden for literally 2.5 hours. and again, convey that message. So you have an opportunity as Vermont's congressman to actually be an advocate and get the message across. And the message I was conveying, loud and clear, that was the one I was hearing from Vermonters. Let's give diplomacy a chance. Let's give it another chance, and let's give it yet another chance.
What did you learn in the Biden meeting, in the 2.5 hours in that?
Well, it was not so much what I learned. It was really an opportunity for us to express to the Vice President our major concerns. I mean, what Vice President Biden was explaining was their rationale. They're concerned about the chemical weapons. They're concerned that if there wasn't the authorization for force, that it would give a green light to Assad. These are all, quote, reasonable concerns that they had. But we were also, the folks I was with, were saying, look, we get it, but this is going to be a precarious vote for you. You know, frankly, I'm not sure they would have succeeded on that vote had it gone to a vote. And we were just conveying to him the overwhelming sentiment that I was expressing from Vermont, some of my colleagues were expressing from their Democratic districts. So, you know, when the president and the vice president are talking to Democrats who have traditionally been supportive, like I've supported President Obama's efforts to get us out of Iraq, bring us home from Afghanistan, and to stay out of Syria. So you've got, they trust that you are trying to be supportive. So if you're giving them bad news, they take it seriously. It's not just a political hit job, okay? So I was trying to play that role and had an opportunity to do it because I had some relationship from my years in Congress with the administration folks.
Let's go to St. Albans next. Peg, good evening. You're on the air.
Yes, hi, Congressman Welch. This is Peg Patry from St. Albans, Vermont.
Okay.
My question is, we already had some missile silos already built years ago in Vermont.
Right.
One in Fairfield, one in Swanton.
Yeah.
Why don't we use what's already there versus thinking of putting it on the military base when we have National Guards in St. Albans and all over the place?
Well, you know what? I just love that question because that's like use it up, wear it out. You know, it's like the way we do it in Vermont. I just think that's fabulous. I don't know the answer to that. You know, I don't know whether the specifications of those silos. By the way, you apparently have top secret briefings because I didn't know that. But whether the specifications would work or not obviously would be a big question. But I don't think we need new missile silos for a Reagan-era Star Wars plan.
Another email question. Why does my government need to spy on me? We've heard stories now about the NSA and the incredible ability they have, including being able to break encryption.
It's outrageous. I mean, this is outrageous. And I voted with Justin Amash, who's a Tea Party conservative from Michigan. And he and I and several others came close to taking away funding from the NSA, where they're going into your emails and mine, monitoring all our phone calls. And what's it for? I mean, you get all of that data. And what do you make out of it? It's not like everyone is a potential terrorist. You know, part of doing good intelligence work, like doing good police work, is to get targeted and focused on realistic places where there may be a threat. And instead, the NSA is just doing this massive grab of everybody's emails and everybody's telephone calls. And I think that's really out of line and across the line, an enormous waste of money. Okay, well, none of us can do anything about it. What are you going to do about it other than call for the funding to be decreased? I mean, can't Congress just shut this down? Yeah, these abuses? Well, what you can do as a member of Congress, it's not just call for it. The Amash amendment came within a few votes of passing, and that was going to defund it. All right, that was real. That put the intelligence community got a pretty clear message that the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats, were on the edge of revolt because we were hearing from our people saying, "What are you doing? This is over the top." So we're starting to see the administration make changes, but we have to revisit this. A number of us have sponsored legislation to significantly curb that NSA sort of global sweep, where we're saying that if they want to come after your email or mine, there's got to be a probable cause in a judicial determination, just like there has to be if the police want to come and search your home or my home. Do you think that vote actually will result in change? Yes. That almost passed? Pardon me, I do. A couple of things are happening. You know, since 9/11, the Homeland Security budget, the security budget, they have grown massively. and they're secret budgets. Now, the Snowden papers indicated that NSA and some of the other spy agencies, it's over $54 billion. And the problem with it being secret, there's twofold. One, none of us know what they're doing. Even a member of Congress doesn't know what they're doing. Number two, if a budget is secret and it's huge, you know they're wasting an awful lot of money. You have no way of kicking the tires and saying, well, they claim it's getting us more secure, it's doing X or Y, but is it really? Or is it just lining the pockets of subcontractors? I mean, Booz Allen, where Snowden worked, they have one client, basically, the United States taxpayer. They make $6 billion, and 98% or so of that money comes from us. What are they doing with it? And the fact is that should be more transparent. You know, we don't want to know operations where they're pursuing a specific lead. That's got to be secret. But we want to know, like, how many personnel they have and how they're doing it, what their plans are, things that would be asked about every other item of expenditure in the federal government.
Edward Snowden, traitor or hero?
Well, that's going to be a judicial determination. You know, I think he did break the law. From his perspective, he's a whistleblower. From the perspective of the law, he's a lawbreaker. And I think he should come back, and I think he should be held to account, but let the courts decide that. But what is true is that the scope of the surveillance of Americans that he's exposed is a real concern. And we have the responsibility in the political world to try to address that.
Did he provide a public service getting that information out?
Well, it's definitely useful in getting the debate. I mean, you've seen what's happened. I mean, people are interested in that. Now, the problem is that I don't know all of the information that came out with Snowden. I mean, the big thing that is on the front page with all of us, including in Congress, pardon me, are the that massive email and surveillance on our email and our telephone calls. There could be sensitive secrets in there that do compromise national security.
All right. One of the other issues, you mentioned the Speaker John Boehner, and there's going to be a discussion coming up in the next few months about, again, raising the debt ceiling, allowing the United States of America to pay its bills. The Speaker is threatening to hold up that debt limit, allowing that to rise unless he sees some action from the President.
And we all know that we've got the issue of the debt ceiling coming up this fall. Now, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling without real cuts in spending. It's as simple as that. We need significant cuts in spending if we're going to replace the sequester and extend the debt limit. I believe that the so-called Boehner rule is the right formula for getting that done.
First, remind us what the Boehner rule is, and do you support his effort to try to get spending cuts in the debt ceiling discussion?
No, I do not. He's playing a very dangerous game, and he's got the most difficult job in Washington because he's got a caucus that is willing, a significant group in his caucus is willing to use this as a tactic to get their way, shutting government down on the budget or defaulting on America's obligations to pay its bills. And that's his problem. He knows that that would be bad for the country. He also knows it would be bad for the Republican Party. And he also knows that Wall Street would react violently if we actually defaulted on our debt. But he's in a bind because within his caucus, the majority are willing to use debt default and government shutdown to try to get their way to repeal Obamacare. Some have a view that they want to get us to outlaw abortion. Some have other points of view, but they think that should be a tactic. That's got to be off limits. I mean, bottom line, we have to pay our bills. You know, I did not support the Iraq War, but there's a lot of bills that we're still paying because we did go to war in Iraq. And I have to be willing to meet our obligations. Just like if you have a mortgage, it might have been more of a mortgage than you wanted, but you got it, and you owe it each month, and it's not optional. So this is a very, very dangerous game that we're playing. In my view, obligations incurred are obligations that have to be paid.
How does the Speaker get himself out of this, though, then?
Well, they're in a jam. I mean, this is why I say it's the toughest job in Congress. He knows that you have to pay your bills. And traditionally, there's been grandstanding by both parties on the debt ceiling, where the party that's in the minority uses it as an opportunity to lecture the party of the majority about their fiscal ways. But they always knew, both sides, that they ultimately had to meet America's obligation to pay its bills. Okay, it's not about authorizing new spending. It's paying bills that you've already incurred. But we've gone in these past couple of years from grandstanding, which is undesirable but understandable, to actually using it as a tactic. And this is a very, very dangerous game, and they've gotten themselves in a corner, and I'm kind of concerned about it, because the Republicans who've been around there a while and are conservative and want to spend less, they know we have to pay our bills and can't use this as a tactic. But there's a significant group of new members that say, hey, we default on our bills, no problem. The sun will rise. Well, that ain't so. That's like you're not paying your mortgage, and something's going to happen that you're not going to like pretty soon.
Speaking of difficult jobs in Washington, the president's going to be deciding soon on a chair of the Federal Reserve. Larry Summers is one of the candidates, and Janet Yellen is the other candidate. A lot of people concerned about Larry Summers getting that job. Are you?
Well, I am. I'm concerned about his history of promoting deregulation in the financial sector. That's a problem. Now, what I want is whoever the new Federal Reserve chairman is has to include in at the top of his concerns the enormous squeeze on the middle class and the rise of just relentless economic inequality. Right now, the economic situation, how wealth is distributed in this country, is like it was before the Great Depression. The top 1% have 20% of the income. The top 10% have 50% of the income. So that's just not a way you have a sustainable middle class. So whoever the new Federal Reserve chair is, I want to be focused like a laser on trying to address that issue. The concerns a lot of people have, myself among them, about Summers is that he was a promoter of the Clinton-era deregulation. That was a big factor, I think, in the downturn in 08.
Vermont Yankee has announced that it's going to stop producing power at the end of 2014. Is there anything you can do as a congressman to make sure that they complete the decommissioning process and pay for it, and Vermonters don't wind up in any way picking up that tab?
Well, I mean, first of all, that's going to be, that's a good thing they're going to close. But we've got some really hardworking folks down there that are going to need our attention. But on the safety issues, we're going to work very closely with the Shumlin administration. I mean, they're going to be taking the lead on this and dealing with the overall impact of this. And of course, there's going to be some impact on the state treasury as well. And I know the Governor Shumlin and the legislature will be working on that. And I know our congressional delegation, Senator Leahy Sanders and I, will be working very closely to do everything we can to support the state to be assured that it is safely decommissioned.
Why do you think it's a good thing that it's closing?
Dangerous. I mean, that thing is old, and also, bottom line, they made a deal with Vermont where if they were allowed to increase their production for a period of time, they would accept the decision of the Vermont General Assembly about whether it got relicensed. So, it's a very simple thing for me. A deal's a deal. And then the General Assembly, in a bipartisan vote that included, by the way, Governor Shumlin, who was then in the Senate, and then Randy Brock, a Republican, who was later his opponent, they both supported shutting it down. So I think the will of the people as expressed by the General Assembly ought to be honored. And I think it was double dealing on the part of Energy to make a deal and then break a deal. So, I mean, that's kind of where I come from.
Why do you think the courts didn't see it that way?
I thought that was a terrible decision. What I understand of the decision is they said that there were too many legislators, that the legislature had a, quote, inappropriate intent, that they were concerned about safety. And I think that's just the ludicrous thing because, you've got 180 legislators, and every one of the members in Congress, it's 435 in the House, we can all have a different intention as to why we're voting yes or no on this bill. The fundamental question from a legal standpoint should be whether the legislature, in this case the General Assembly, had authority to do what it did. So you're a legislator who's living in the zone of Vermont Yankee, and people are really a little bit nervous when the cooling towers collapse or there's leaking radiation into the underground water supply. How are you not concerned about safety? It may not be your jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean you're not concerned. So the court, I think, just blew it on that.
Andy in Williston says in an email, asks, healthcare costs continue to skyrocket. Subsidies for premiums for the new rates using the Healthcare Connect will help some, though the underlying costs remain too high. How is it that a healthcare premium for those not eligible for a subsidy are on par with a mortgage payment? If you think, as I do, how do we reduce healthcare costs to drive down premiums?
Well, first of all, I agree with his point that the healthcare costs are too high. I mean, that's the whole problem with healthcare in this country. We spend the most and get the least. And Vermont is not the worst off, but the real problem in healthcare is the fee-for-service system drives up utilization, and it results in excessive expense and oftentimes not great outcomes. And the whole a long-term challenge is to get to a model where you're rewarding wellness, and the accountable care organizations that are part of this healthcare bill, trying to treat people to keep them well and not run the meter and start billing and pay for performance, as opposed to every time you do a procedure, every time you give a Band-Aid, you get more money. I mean, that's the challenge of getting from here to there, but I agree with him.
Colorado and Washington have now legalized marijuana. The Governor Shumlin says he would support it but doesn't want to make it a priority. Do you support legalization of marijuana?
Well, we need a smarter marijuana policy, and I think we're getting there. You know, Vermont's taken some steps, medical marijuana, which I supported, decriminalization, which I thought made sense. And now you're seeing that discussion generated in Washington. Senator Leahy just had a Judiciary Committee hearing where the focus was trying to get the federal laws to have some deference to states that are moving as Vermont is, as Colorado did. So I don't know where we're going to end up, but it's broken open the discussion. People get it, that that's different, that the policy that we've had, particularly of jailing people, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think we're moving in the right direction towards a smarter policy on marijuana.
So would you ultimately support legalization if it happened?
You know, I think that's where we're kind of headed. This is going to be a debate that's got to go on its own pace in the states. You know, again, Vermont did a step with medical marijuana that was controversial. Then it did a next step on decriminalization. So when is it ready to take the next step? You know, that's the discussion.
Immigration reform was all anybody seemed to be talking about before the whole Syria situation came upon the scene. What's going to happen with that?
I think we're going to pass it. I do. It can be tough, but the bottom line there is that a lot of Republicans know that their future is going to depend on whether they're seen as being at least sympathetic to a practical resolution of a very practical challenge, and that's immigration reform. You know, we need a way to secure our borders, but there's been a lot more enforcement along the borders. And by the way, the immigration issue has diminished a lot as the economy has changed. And in fact, there's some evidence that more immigrants are going back than coming here. But we have to have some resolution for the folks that have been here, and that includes kids who were born here, and they're not or came here with their parents, and they're not legal, but they're living in the economy. They're contributing. They want to go to school. Vermont needs it. You know, we've got a lot of farm labor, which is really essential to us getting the cows milked. And so we've got to do this. And I think we can, and I think there's enough Republicans who understand both the merits of the arguments and also the political imperative for them.
The Vermont chapter of the ACLU has released a report. They're going to talk about it in more detail next week, talking about the security and what's going on the northern border, on the Canadian border, in terms, again, back to this issue of our privacy. Is there too much eavesdropping going on the northern border?
I don't know the specifics of what you're talking about, but you know, in general, since 9/11, I think the tendency has been to overdo it rather than get it right. Now, it's understandable, you know, after 9/11, but now, you know, we're moving on, and I think it's time to take a look at what works, what doesn't, get the balance right between privacy and security.
I want to go back. Let's go back to where we began here. And I want to remind you, too, we appreciate all your calls tonight. If you want to reach Congressman Welch, there are a number of different ways that you can. We have a number of phone numbers and addresses, as well as internet website contact for you for his Washington as well as his Burlington office. And as you've heard him say, he had quite a had quite a showing for his telephone town hall meeting, so he welcomes your input. Let's talk about Syria here again to conclude, and really where your bottom line is here. So what has to happen in these most current negotiations for you to be satisfied that we don't take a military action?
Well, there's two things. Okay, number one, Assad not using chemical weapons again. I mean, that's the bottom line, because that's what's really going to make an impact on people in Syria, and that's what'll be a finger in the eye to the United States and the world community. You know, Assad did it once. We know he did it, and now he does it again, even after he said he'll work with Russia to put his chemical weapons under international supervision. So I think that's the bottom line. If he does not use chemical weapons again, then it's hard for me to see any basis whatsoever for us having a military strike, just for punitive reasons, when that would unleash so much harm or danger to so many people who weren't at fault, okay? And my view is that Assad and others should be tried as war criminals for violations that are proven.
Thanks for coming in tonight. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us on the program tonight. Thank you to those of you, too, that joined us by telephone. A reminder, tomorrow evening at 7:30, Vermont This Week, at the latest news on what's happening right here in our home state with your host, Stuart Ledbetter. For all of us here at VPT, I'm Mark Johnson. Have a great night.